You are standing in a city that once called itself half of the world. Isfahan does not feel like a place that should fall. Its domes still rise into the sky. Its avenues still stretch with quiet confidence. Its mosques still hold the echo of an empire that believed it was chosen to endure. And yet, by the early 18th century, something beneath the surface had already begun to give way. The Safavid Empire did not collapse in a single moment. There was no instant when power simply disappeared. What happened instead was slower, quieter, and far more dangerous. The strength that had once held Persia together began to weaken from within, long before any enemy reached its gates. If you had walked these streets a generation earlier, you would have seen a very different world. Under Shah Abbas the Great, the Safavid state had been disciplined, ambitious, and outward-looking. Authority was visible, leadership was present. The empire moved with purpose, but that energy did not last. After his reign, the character of power changed. The rulers who followed were no longer shaped by campaigns or hardship. They were raised in controlled environments, removed from the realities of the provinces they governed. Distance grew between the throne and the people. Decisions became slower. Confidence turned into hesitation. From the outside, the empire still appeared intact. The architecture remained magnificent. The rituals of court continued. Trade still passed through its cities. Nothing about it suggested immediate collapse. But internally, the foundations were no longer as stable as they seemed. Authority became less decisive. Communication weakened. Problems in distant regions were no longer addressed with urgency. What had once been a unified system began to fragment in subtle ways. This is what makes the fall of the Safavid Empire so striking. It was not a sudden disaster. It was a gradual loss of direction. By the time the final blow came in 1736, much of the damage had already been done. The empire had been hollowed out over decades, leaving behind the image of power without its substance. And that is where this story truly begins. Now, imagine what happens when power no longer leaves the palace. After Shah Abbas the Great, something fundamental changed at the heart of the Safavid state. The earlier rulers had been shaped by conflict. They rode with their armies. They understood the risks of the frontier because they had faced them directly. Authority was not just a title. It was something they exercised in real time, under pressure. But the rulers who followed lived very different lives. Instead of growing up in the open world of governance and war, many Safavid princes were raised inside the royal court, often within the harem system. Their education was controlled, their experiences limited, and their contact with the outside world carefully managed. By the time they became Shah, they had little direct understanding of the empire they were meant to rule. You can feel the distance beginning to form. The throne was still there. The ceremonies continued. Orders were still issued in the name of the Shah. But the center of gravity had shifted. Real influence no longer depended on leadership in the field. It depended on proximity to the ruler. Those closest to the Shah began to matter more than those most capable. Court officials, eunuchs, and influential figures within the palace gained increasing control over decisions. Access became power. Information could be shaped, delayed, or withheld entirely. The Shah, instead of directing events, often reacted to what others chose to present. Over time, this created a system that could no longer function effectively. Different factions within the court competed for influence. Alliances formed and dissolved. Decisions were influenced by rivalry rather than necessity. Instead of a clear chain of command, authority became fragmented. And when authority fragments, coordination begins to fail. Provincial issues were no longer addressed with urgency. Military leadership lost coherence. The connection between the center and the edges of the empire weakened. What once had been a unified structure slowly turned into competing circles of influence. From the outside, none of this was immediately visible. The empire still looked stable. The Shah still sat on the throne. The rituals of power continued to project confidence. But inside the court, the system was no longer working as it should. The Safavid state had not lost its territory yet. It had not suffered its final defeat. But it had already lost something just as important. It had lost control over itself. Now, step away from the palace for a moment and look at something even more fragile than power. Look at money. Because while the court was losing control politically, the empire was also weakening in a quieter, more structural way. Its economy was under pressure, and not in a way that could be easily fixed. The Safavid Empire did not have strong domestic sources of silver. That mattered more than it might seem at first. In the early modern world, silver was not just wealth. It was the backbone of currency. It was what allowed states to pay soldiers, sustain trade, and maintain confidence in their own systems. Without it, everything becomes harder to hold together. Persia relied heavily on trade to bring silver into the country. Goods flowed through its Almudden, caravans moved across vast distances, and for a time, this system worked. The empire became a crossroads of commerce, connecting different regions and economies. But there was a problem. As silver entered, it also left. A significant portion of it moved eastward, toward the Mughal Empire in India, where demand for bullion was high and persistent. Over time, more silver was leaving the Safavid economy than staying within it. This created a steady drain that could not be easily reversed. You can almost picture it like a slow leak. At first, it is barely noticeable. Trade continues. Markets still function. But gradually, the imbalance grows. The state finds it harder to maintain stable coinage. The currency begins to lose its reliability. Confidence weakens. Efforts were made to respond. Officials attempted to control the flow, to adjust policies, to stabilize the system. But these measures could not fully compensate for the underlying issue. By the early 18th century, the effects were clear. Mints became less active. The quality and availability of coinage declined. The treasury no longer held the reserves it once did. And when a state cannot sustain its finances, the consequences spread quickly. The military feels it first. Soldiers need to be paid. Campaigns require resources, equipment, logistics, loyalty. All of it depends on a functioning financial system. As the treasury weakened, so did the army's ability to respond effectively. And this is where the danger deepens. Because at the very moment when the Safavid state needed strength and coordination, it was running out of the means to support either. What you are seeing here is not just an economic problem. It is a slow erosion of the empire's ability to defend itself. Now, let's talk about something that once held this empire together. Religion. When the Safavid state was first established, Twelver Shia Islam was not just a belief system, it was a unifying force. It gave the empire a distinct identity, something that separated it from its powerful Sunni neighbors like the Ottomans. It helped turn a collection of regions into something more cohesive, more defined. For a time, this worked. It created loyalty. It gave the state a sense of purpose. It allowed the Safavid rulers to anchor their authority in something deeper than politics alone. But over time, that same force began to change. As religious authority grew stronger within the state, its tone became more rigid. Influential clerics gained greater influence over policy and society. What had once been a source of unity gradually became a framework of control. And control, when it hardens, can begin to exclude. Minority communities faced increasing restrictions. Legal and social pressures intensified. But the most serious consequences appeared on the empire's eastern frontier, where large Sunni populations lived under Safavid rule. Among them were the Pashtun tribes. These communities were not simply different in belief. They were part of the empire's borderlands, regions that required careful management and mutual trust. Stability there depended on cooperation, not coercion. But that balance began to break. Policies became more forceful. Religious differences were no longer managed with flexibility. In some cases, there were attempts to impose conformity through pressure and humiliation. What might have been handled through negotiation instead deepened resentment. You can sense the shift. People who had once been subjects of the empire began to feel like outsiders within it. Loyalty weakened, trust eroded. And in places like Kandahar, frustration did not remain quiet. It turned into resistance. This is where the Safavid state made one of its most critical miscalculations. It underestimated how quickly religious tension could transform into political rebellion. It assumed authority would be enough to maintain control. But authority without trust is fragile. By the time open resistance emerged among the Pashtun tribes, the empire was already struggling in other ways. Its leadership was divided. Its finances were strained. Its ability to respond decisively had weakened. And now, it faced a challenge from within its own borders. What began as religious pressure had created something far more dangerous. It had created an enemy. Now, this is the moment where everything that had been building finally breaks. Not with a sudden explosion, but with a challenge the Safavid Empire could no longer contain. It begins on the eastern frontier, in Kandahar, a place that had already felt the weight of tension, where trust between the state and its Sunni Pashtun subjects had been steadily eroding. Among these communities, one figure emerges with clarity and purpose: Mirwais Hotak. He had spent time within the Safavid world, even in Isfahan itself, observing how power functioned at the center. He saw the distance between authority and reality. He saw the hesitation, the fragmentation, the lack of decisive control. And when he returned to Kandahar, he acted. In 1709, Mirwais led a successful uprising against Safavid authority in the region. It was not just a local disturbance, it was a signal. The empire's hold on its frontier was no longer secure. What is striking is how the Safavid state responded. It tried to restore control, but its efforts lacked coordination and consistency. The military campaigns that followed did not achieve lasting results. Kandahar remained outside effective Safavid control, and over time, the rebellion solidified into something more organized. After Mirwais, leadership passed to his son Mahmud Hotak. And this is where the story accelerates. In 1722, Mahmud made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just years earlier. Instead of remaining on the frontier, he led his forces westward, across difficult terrain, toward the heart of the Safavid Empire, toward Isfahan. Now pause for a moment and consider what that means. A force drawn from a regional uprising was moving directly against one of the great capitals of the early modern world. This was not supposed to happen, not to a state that had once commanded such authority. The two sides met near the village of Gulnabad. On paper, the Safavid army had advantages. It was larger, it represented the established power of the state. But what unfolded there tells you everything about the condition of the empire at that point. Coordination broke down. Command was unclear. Units did not act with unity or confidence. The Afghan forces, though smaller, were more cohesive and decisive. They pressed their advantage, while the Safavid army struggled to respond effectively. And then, something even more important happened. The will to fight began to collapse. This was not simply a battlefield defeat measured by numbers or tactics. It was the visible result of years of internal weakening. The army that once represented the strength of the Safavid state no longer carried the same sense of purpose. At Gulnabad, that reality became impossible to ignore. The Safavid forces were defeated, and the path to Isfahan was left open. When Mahmud Hotak advanced toward the capital, there was no longer a strong, coordinated system in place to stop him. What had once been unthinkable was now unfolding step by step. And as you watch this moment, it becomes clear, the empire was not defeated because it lacked soldiers. It was defeated because it had already lost the ability to act as one. Now you are inside Isfahan, and everything that once felt permanent is beginning to disappear. After the shikast at Gulnabad, Mahmud Hotak did not rush to destroy the city. Instead, he surrounded it. What followed was not a dramatic assault, but something slower and far more devastating. A siege. For months, the Safavid capital was cut off from the outside world. Supplies stopped coming in, trade halted, movement was restricted. At first, there may have been hope that relief would arrive, that the state would recover enough to push back. But that help never came. As the weeks passed, conditions inside the city began to deteriorate. Food became scarce. Prices rose beyond reach. What had once been a thriving imperial center turned into a place of uncertainty, then fear, and eventually desperation. You can imagine how it felt. Families searching for anything to eat. Markets no longer functioning. The slow realization that the system they depended on was no longer there to protect them. Historical accounts describe the sheddet of the famine that followed. People were forced to survive on whatever they could find. Animals that would never have been considered food were consumed. Even then, it was not enough. By the end of the siege, tens of thousands had died within the city. Many estimates place the number around 80,000. Not soldiers on a battlefield, but but civilians trapped inside their own capital. And at the center of it all was Shah Sultan Hussein. He is often remembered as a gentle ruler, not a decisive one. In a moment that defines the end of the Safavid story, he chose not to prolong the suffering. Facing starvation and collapse, he surrendered the city to Mahmud Hotak. It was not a dramatic fall of a throne in battle. It was a quiet act, made in the shadow of overwhelming human cost. The Safavid name did not disappear immediately after this. For a short time, it continued in a diminished form, supported by shifting Al-Quwa and attempts to restore stability. But the empire, as it had existed, was already gone. The final chapter came in 1736. Nader Shah, a military leader who had risen through the chaos, succeeded in pushing out the Afghan forces and reclaiming much of the lost territory. But instead of restoring Safavid rule, he made a different choice. He removed the last Safavid ruler, Abbas III, and declared himself Shah. With that, the Safavid Empire came to an end after more than 2 centuries. And if you step back and look at the whole story, it leaves you with something difficult to ignore. This was not just the result of an external invasion. By the time the final blow arrived, the empire had already been weakened from within. What you have witnessed is not just the fall of a dynasty. It is a reminder of how power can fade long before it finally breaks. If there is one thing I keep thinking about after this story, it is how the Safavid Empire did not fall because of one moment, but because it slowly lost its direction. To me, that makes it far more human and far more tragic. I would love to hear what you think about this sukut. Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to When History Broke so we can explore more together.